released a mobile version of the game engine. GDevelop is now the first no-code open source game engine to exist on mobile devices. So now you'll be able to create and work on your games while on the go, with an app that's been tailored for mobile devices. This new version of the app should be the perfect companion for developers. They'll be able to create and work on their games, check on their analytics and performance, manage leaderboards, check on player feedback, and even publish their games anywhere they are in the world. This app is being treated like one of our online services, similar to the leaderboards and cloud storage, where you can download and use it for free, but in order to get full access to it, you'll want to get a silver or gold subscription, which you can actually get for really cheap right now over on Fanatical with our latest bundle. Along with thousands of assets, you'll get a 12-month subscription to GDevelop for just $15. Subscriptions help keep the online services free and to allow GDevelop to continue improving so the engine can get even better. But if you're using the mobile app without a subscription, the most notable restrictions are 1 scene per project, 20 objects per scene, and 30 events, with no limits to the number of conditions and actions inside of those events. However, if you're opening an existing project that's already beyond those limits, you'll have access to all of your scenes, all of your objects, and all of your events. And you can tweak and modify them, but you won't be able to add anything new without a subscription. Publishing is the same as it is on the desktop and web build version of the engine, so you'll be able to create your games from scratch or make changes to an existing one, and then publish your game from your phone to all of the platforms that we already support. To be clear, the main engine is not changing in any way because this app is now released. You can continue to use the desktop and web version of the engine for free, just as you always have. The mobile app is just an extra benefit for people who want to be able to have access to their games without needing their computer with them at all times. So go check out the new mobile app. There's a link to it in the description. Is hard. So we're going to go over the process of developing a game by yourself or with a small team, as well as things that you should be doing and things that you definitely shouldn't. Starting with understanding scope. You probably thought I would start by talking about prototyping your game idea, but before doing anything, you need to be aware of scope, which is basically how big your game is going to be. A lot of people jump into game development hoping to make the kinds of games that they themselves usually play, whether it's something like Doom Eternal, or Animal Crossing, or something in between. You as an individual, or even a small team, are not going to make that game. Those kinds of games are made by hundreds of people over multiple years with tens or hundreds of millions of dollars in funding. You need to be clever. Be smart with your time and resources because you probably don't have much of either. Picking genres that let you use, or reuse, a minimal number of assets is where you're really going to find success as an indie. Metroidvanias, where people spend a lot of time backtracking and exploring the same spaces with new tools, like Hollow Knight, that was made by 3 people, or roguelikes, where people are constantly doing the same run and fighting the same enemies, but with randomized layouts and upgrades. If your roguelike game can use a bunch of cards instead of animating characters and enemies, you can squeeze out a lot of extra playtime in your game without spending much on assets, like Balatro, that was developed by 1 person. The takeaway for scope is that the amount of time required to make a finished game is way more than most people expect, and it's something you only figure out with time and experience. So if you don't have either of those, and especially if this is your first game, plan to make the smallest thing that is technically a game and release it. Next is picking your game idea. Start by thinking of game genres with mechanics that you already mostly know how to make. It's fine if you'll need to learn a few things along the way, but if you've never done anything with online multiplayer or card games before, then you probably shouldn't make an online card game because you'll be dedicating more time to learning how to do it and fixing your mistakes than actually making the game. Even though creating multiplayer games in GDevelop with the built-in multiplayer system is way easier than coding everything yourself, there are still things that you'll need to learn and figure out in order to make your game with it. Lean into your strength. If you have an artist on your team who is great at large character portraits or still images, but isn't good at animating, then think of how your game could be built to make the best use of that skill. Use the mechanics that you, or your team, already know how to do, as well as your strength, to help limit the kind of game you decide to make. And then spend time brainstorming several ideas that work within those limitations that you would also be interested in actually making. This is an excellent time to consider marketability and the actual audience for your game. There are lots of resources out there to help you pick between your different ideas and which platforms you should be releasing those types of games on. So do a little research into which game idea will actually be worth spending your time on and which platform you should be looking at when releasing that game. Takeaway: pick a game idea that you know you can not only make, but that you can make well, and one that you're confident people will actually want to play. Then there's planning. So many people fall victim to scope creep, which is when your game's scope increases unintentionally, and that's usually because they started developing their game without a solid plan in place. It's a lot of fun to add new cool features to your game, but you can end up with a game that's way too big to actually finish. It's easy to get lost if you didn't know where you were going in the first place. So break your game down into big chunks, and sort them in order of importance as they relate to gameplay. So for example, Vampire Survivors could be broken down into player, enemies, leveling system, and miscellaneous, for menus and things that are important but not core to the gameplay. For this you can use free online organization tools, like Trello or Notion, then add on playtesting and game polish, break each chunk down again into medium-sized chunks, and then sort them again, but this time in the order they need to get made in order to make sense with the game's development. Like if you break enemies into basic enemies and bosses, obviously you need something to attack in order to gain experience and levels, but it's probably more important to get the leveling system set up so you can push off the boss to later in development. You can break these down a few more times to figure out your game's general development timeline, then give each chunk a deadline. This part is critical, because a task usually takes as much time as you give it. Set deadlines based on your best estimate, and try to hit them, but don't beat yourself up if you don't. Some things will probably go wrong or take longer than you expected. That's normal and something that you see in the games industry all of the time. The takeaway is, break your game into manageable chunks and set deadlines to make sure you know where you're headed and that you won't get lost in development. Next is the actual development part. You just take the next chunk on your game's development timeline, break it down into individual tasks, and then complete those tasks. Some common things that people get wrong in this phase are not doing version control, trying to do everything on their own, and not doing enough playtesting. So let's talk about version control, which is basically the practice of making sure that you're saving separate saves of your project whenever you add a new feature or make a new change. So you always have the older versions of the game to roll back to if anything goes wrong. Like if you accidentally delete or break something in your game while you're working on it, or if the game file itself gets corrupted. It also helps to save your game online to make sure your progress isn't lost if something happens to your device, like if it just spontaneously catches fire. GDevelop already offers cloud storage for games, and there's built-in version control for anybody with a Pro subscription. But you can also store your game on other hosting platforms like GitHub. Then there's trying to do it all. It's natural as the game's developer to want to figure out everything yourself. It usually gives you a sense of pride, and it can actually be a lot of fun to tackle new challenges. But your goal here is to make a game. So if you find yourself stuck on a problem for more than a couple of hours, reach out and get help. There are tutorials you can watch, assets you can buy, and tons of solutions to be found online. And then there's playtesting. We've already done a video on that before, but most people don't bother doing any playtesting till far too late in development. People are usually afraid of showing their work while it's still in the rough prototyping phase, which is normal, but not helpful. Schedule playtesting throughout your game's development to make sure things are intuitive and people understand how to play the game, as well as to check for bugs and design choices that confuse players. The takeaway for development is just to get to work on your plan and just do it. Make sure you have secure backups to roll back to, don't stay stuck on something that you can find the answer to online, and show your game to people often and early. And then there's the launch of your game, which is mostly about marketing. For marketing, you should be showing off your game and getting people excited about it throughout development. But since we already did a video on marketing and how to get your first 10,000 players, click on this video to learn more. Third video about multiplayer in GDevelop. The last two videos covered the basics of multiplayer and making games with it, but there have been a number of patches and updates to the multiplayer system in GDevelop that we're going to talk about in this video. Jumping right into variables. Specifically, which variables are being sent and by who. From the last two videos, you already know about taking ownership of a variable. So to use this in an actual game, it would be something like this, where each player will take control of their own personal score and send that information to the other players. But what we didn't talk about was that it takes ownership of the root variable, which is why these variables are laid out individually. Because if I tried to use a structure, the variable that would be taken is the root variable. So whoever owns the root variable controls all of the other variables in that structure or array. And then there's an action to desync a variable so that it's not being sent to any players at all. And this is useful for a lot of things, like controls in your game, so that each player can set their own individual controls, or for settings like volume, which you can just set up at the beginning of scene. Next are some controls for the multiplayer behavior. Because of the last videos, you already know about taking ownership of an object and desyncing individual behaviors, which is useful for things like the smooth camera behavior. But now there's a new feature for the behavior that gives you a little more control. And that's the action to change the synchronization rate of all of your objects with the multiplayer behavior. So you can use the action object synchronization rate and change it to equal something between 1 and 60. And this is basically the number of times per second that objects send their information to other games with the multiplayer behavior. So if you have something like a card game where you don't need to send information very often, you might be able to set your synchronization rate down to 1. Or if you have something like an FPS game that requires more up-to-date timing, you can set it to 60 per second. But by default, it's set to 30. And this action will only apply to the game that it's set on, so make sure it's set at the beginning of scene for all of the games. Now let's talk about the new templates in the engine. There are a bunch of premium and free examples in the engine that you can open up and either learn from or build off of to make your own multiplayer game. And they're all set up a little differently, so you know the different options for creating multiplayer games. So for example, in the physics-based bounce puzzle game, there are two different player objects for player 1 and player 2, and the ownership is set in the behavior inside the object, which is a rigid way to build your game, but totally valid if you only have a couple of players. And then there's Arrow Fight, where there are multiple instances of the same object already placed in the game scene, and you use an ID variable to decide which player owns which instance of the object. And then lastly, there's the Rage Jump game, where there's no player object in the scene to begin with, and instead, when each player joins the game, they create an instance of the player object in their game and take ownership of it, and then the multiplayer behavior spawns that player in the other games. Which is probably the most flexible setup, and is one of the best options for games when players are constantly going to be joining and leaving. Which leads us to our next new feature, players joining mid-game, or dropping out. So in your game dashboard, in the multiplayer settings, there's a new checkbox for allow players to join after the game has started. And this is on by default, but if your game is set up in a way that it can't really handle players joining mid-game, you can turn this off and be sure to save it. Then once a lobby game has started, nobody else can join. But if you do want players to be able to join mid-game, there are some new conditions that let you know when they've joined your game. So there's the player has joined condition, where you can use the player number to check if a specific player has joined. But there's also any player has joined, so you can check if any player has joined your game and then respond accordingly, by either spawning new enemies or adjusting the game in some way to compensate for new players. And there's also conditions for if a player has left. And again, you can use the player number, or check if any player has left. Those features are useful for other players if they join or leave the game. But what about the host? Now there's a feature for host migration that happens automatically. So if the host leaves the game, then the remaining player with the lowest ping automatically becomes the new host of the game. Because this process could take a couple of seconds and cause some problems in your game, there's a condition to check if the host is currently migrating. Then you can use that to pause your game to prevent the players from doing anything while the host is migrating. But if your specific game is going to have trouble with the host migrating, in a game where, for example, the host is the one who has the game world saved on their computer, then you can use the action to configure your lobby game to end when the host leaves, at the beginning of scene for all of the games. If you want to see the first two videos on multiplayer in GDevelop, then click on one of these videos. GDevelop 5.3 is here. GDevelop is being constantly updated with smaller patches all of the time. So 5.3 is really all of the work that's been done between 5.2 and now, where there's been enough change to add an entire 0.1 to the version number. Like most patches, this update comes with tiny improvements, and then there were extensions like the 3D particle emitter being released, and the in-app purchases extension being updated to work with Google Play Billing version 5. And there were new asset packs added, like tileable ground textures, and the Dungeon Castle Mighty Bundle, as well as some bug fixes. But for now, let's jump into the bigger ticket feature items, like object folders, which is something the community has been asking for a long time. They've replaced the old tag system and can be used to sort and organize your objects, just like you would on your own computer. And they work for both scene objects and global objects. And for anyone wondering how they replace tags in the actions and conditions searching for objects, well, now you can search by folder to find the objects that you want. Next up is a new variable syntax, which basically means this is now replaced with just this. For declared variables, you no longer need to type out global variable, bracket, variable name, bracket. So as long as a variable is declared, it will show up in the autocomplete when you're typing things in. And this should make variables way easier to use for beginners, but also make it a lot faster for experienced users to do what they were doing before. So it requires less typing, it's easier to read, and it's far more condensed. Next is project collaboration. This feature is only for the startup and business plan, so you need one of those subscriptions in order to use this. It's an online feature that allows multiple people to work on a single project. So if you have a cloud project, you can add a collaborator and they'll be able to see and edit that cloud project. Next up is Steamworks integration, built directly into the engine, which is really exciting. This can help people with achievements, networking, matchmaking, user-generated content, getting player information, and can help as an anti-cheat or DRM. It is a huge deal for those of us trying to release on Steam. It should make that process a lot easier. And then there's premium game templates, which is a new thing being announced where game templates can now be sold. So not only will you be able to make money by selling art and music assets, now you'll be able to do that with full game templates. The next thing is support for Unicode, which means emojis, accented characters, Arab, Chinese, Korean, Japanese, and more will now work as valid characters in Engine. Some platforms will have trouble with non-UTF-8 characters, so be careful naming your assets with those characters, but in Engine, you'll be able to use everything all the way up to emojis. And then there's a big one that I'm really excited about, and that's that there's no longer duplicate actions and conditions for every different kind of object. So if you want to scale an object, it's not scale a tiled object, or scale a sprite object, or scale a 3D object, it's just scale. And that's been done for every kind of action and condition in the engine, which makes searching for things manually so much easier. And of course it's going to help with beginners who wouldn't know the difference. Then, for the education plan subscription, there's the classroom view, where the admin of the education plan can now open up student projects in a view-only mode so they can see what their students are working on and maybe where they're struggling. And the last thing is going to help a lot of people, because before, if you were using a cloud project, there was no autosave. So the newest feature is an autosave for cloud projects. And for anybody who's been saved by autosave when they're working on something and they exit accidentally or the power goes out or something, you know just how awesome this feature is and how much it's going to help people who use the cloud builds to build their game. Thank you to everyone involved in getting us from 5.2 to 5.3. If you want to see all of the things that were left out of this video, they're in the description in the patch notes. But for now, I think we're all looking forward to 5.4. Are 6 reasons to use GDevelop, the no-code open source game engine that can help you create any 2D game you can imagine, and even some in 3D. The first reason is the no-code system. All of the logic made for your game in GDevelop uses this easy-to-read wording and if-then format, where if the condition is true, then the action will happen, which is just far easier to read and more compact than pages of code. The second reason is because GDevelop is open source. The entire engine can be found, looked through, and downloaded on GitHub. And because it's open source, the base engine is free to use, and always will be. There are some online services that you can pay for that will improve the game making experience, but it's not required to jump in and start making your game. The third reason is the built-in behaviors and extensions. Behaviors are prepackaged game logic that you can slot into your game to make mechanics that would otherwise take a long time to make yourself. And the engine comes with a bunch of these pre-installed, like top-down movement, light behaviors, and the physics engine. But you can find over 100 extensions that you can install that were created by other game developers in the community. These range from firing a bullet all the way to allowing gamepad controls. The fourth reason is the built-in asset store and tools. The engine has an asset store full of both free and paid assets, with pre-built objects that you can just directly import into your game, as well as built-in tools like Piskel for image editing and JFXR for creating sound effects. The fifth reason is because you can use the engine anywhere. There are desktop versions for Windows, Mac OS, and Linux, but you can also use the engine through a browser window or even on your mobile phone while you're on the go. And the final reason is the one-click export. So finally, when you're finished building your game, GDevelop handles all of the packaging for you. When you select the type of export you want to do, you can publish the game with a single click. Games exported with GDevelop are then entirely yours. You can publish and sell your game on Steam, or Epic Game Store, or any other storefront you'd like. You can also put ads or in-app purchases in your game and distribute your game on mobile devices. After you finish building your game, it's entirely up to you what you do with it. But do please share it with us on social media. We love to see and share whatever people are making with GDevelop. Here are 6 reasons to use GDevelop. Using 3D with GDevelop. This video is being released early, so everything being talked about in this video is being worked on and will be out in the next GDevelop update. Now there are a number of community extensions, like the one Pandako made, but this video is going to be about the 3D features now built in to GDevelop. So let's have a look. I'm going to start by making a 3D box. There are also 3D models, but we're going to start with the 3D box, or 3D cube. So this object actually only has a few settings, but it has a different image for each side of the box. So let me add some of those images in, starting with the front face image, which is the top from our perspective. So if I place that into the scene now, we'll see it on top. And you can check whether or not one of the faces are actually showing. And that way you can disable it if you want to save on performance, because that side of the box is just not showing. And you can also set it to stretch or to tile on each individual image. So to act like a sprite object or act like a tiled sprite. And now we need to go to the layers. And we actually have a setting here now for 3D. So if you want to make 2D games, you just leave this alone and work like you would otherwise. But if you want to make 3D games, you need to change this setting to either display only 3D objects or display both on this layer. Obviously that's slower. So we'll start with just 3D objects. Press apply. Now if I place a couple of these in scene, there we go. You can see that they are 3D. If I give it the draggable behavior, I can drag them around. You can see this side, and over here you can see this side. Now if I give it the platform behavior and add a platformer character, we can have a 3D game going with a platformer character. We do need to change the layer settings to display both 2D and 3D objects. Now if we change the elevation, there we go. The beginnings of a 3D game. And you can actually take it one step further and go all the way with this. And create games in a 3D space with 2D characters. Okay, now let's get rid of that. Change this back to 3D only, and talk about moving the camera in a 3D plane. So I can go to the event sheet and add in a bunch of events to do this. There's a new action for camera Z position, and we'll use that to go up and down. So now if I look around, I can go along the X and Y plane and then use this button to zoom in and zoom out in a 3D space. Simple enough. The next thing I want to do though is make it so that the camera moves and rotates and twists. So one of the actions we can use for that is to look at. And we can set the camera to look at an object. So now we're looking at the box as we rotate around it. And we can twist the plane around, and we can get real close, get below it. And because I have the bottoms of these objects checked off or unchecked, they don't show up when you look at them from this angle. Now let's create a 3D camera object. So we'll make a 3D box and just call it camera. And we don't need to give it any images. We can place it in scene. Now we can set the camera to be equal to that object's position and use these events to move that object. There isn't currently a force that you can apply in the Z direction along the Z axis, but you can still apply forces just like you would to any other object in 2D along the X and Y. And now the camera is following the camera box object instead of us just moving the camera by itself. Then the next thing to show is the pointer lock extension, which will be really useful for any of you people that want to make FPS games. What that's going to do is lock my cursor into the screen when I click into it. So now it's gone. And no matter how much I drag, it's not going to leave the screen. But what I want to do with this is use it to control the camera box object so I can look around with the mouse. And I'm not going to lie to you, I don't remember how to do it, but there will be examples released that have this functionality, so you can probably just go in and copy the camera controls to paste it into your own game. That's probably the easiest thing to do. So the camera in that game and this game are both called camera, so I don't need to change anything. But if the object I was using was called player or something else, I would need to go in and change this camera into player, as well as in here along these expressions. So what this is doing is changing the angle of the camera object by adding the mouse pointer lock's position, movement along the x-axis, divided by 20. So just how the mouse is moving divided by 20, because it moves really fast if you don't divide it by 20. And if you want to change the speed that the camera moves at or rotates at, this is the number you want to change. And then this is changing the rotation along the y-axis, clamping it, using the camera's rotation plus the mouse's movement, divided by 20 again, but keeping it between -90 and +90 so you can't look all the way up and all the way down. And then these are just positioning events that make the camera look the way the object is. So I can actually get rid of these ones. There we go. Now I am looking around with the mouse. I did need to add this one though because there's no action for Z order or Z axis in these events. There we go. Now I'm walking around like a character would. I am unfortunately not moving the way I would want to because I'm still going up and down based on those actions, but I can change that. There we go. Now when I press the W key, I'll move towards the angle the camera is facing. All right. And the rest of the first-person movement controls will be in the examples that get released. But for now, you can see pretty well how it works. Okay, the next thing I want to show you is the billboard extension. And for now, you might need to copy this from an existing example to get it. But once you have the extension, you can create a 3D object that continuously looks at you, which is great for 2D cutout cardboard that you don't want to appear as 3D boxes, but as 2D images in a 3D plane. And so for this, I'll create a 3D box and only add an image to the back face. And I'll turn off all of the other faces. Add the behavior to the object, and then place it in scene. And now, unlike the boxes that are 3D static objects, this will always be looking at me. And you'll want to enable the transparency so that you don't have the black box around the character. Okay, so now I'm going to show a few examples of what can be done with this extension, the first of which is just a shooting example. This is a first-person perspective with the WASD movement and the mouse cursor being what aims the camera.
Arcade mode.
This is using raycasting or hit scan. Hit scan is more popular with more recent games. Then there's this Sokoban example I made, where I took the Sokoban game and changed it to have a 3D perspective, where you can walk around in the game itself in 3D, and then change it to 2D to see where you actually are in a maze. And then this last one was made by Davey. And this is a race car example that uses a lot of different mechanics to get the game to look the way it does. Firstly, 3D models, but also using a tiled sprite for the background and billboarding for the trees, and it uses a fog effect on the layer. So if we go to the base layer, you'll see that all the other effects don't work on 3D, but fog, exponential, and linear do. You can change the color and the density, and that will affect how the game looks. Obviously, the white fog looked better in this case because the background is white, or light. Okay, so talking about 3D models, let's go back to that original game. 3D models need to be in the GLB format. And to get that format for every kind of model you need, if whatever the modeling software you're using doesn't export to GLB, or whatever assets you got aren't in that format, you can take them over into Blender by importing them in with the format they're currently in, and then export them to GLB. There is no lighting in the game though, so it's a good idea to use objects that have lots of detail. Because if you put an object in that has a shape but only one color, it's not going to look like anything. And so if I add a 3D model, add in the GLB file, and then place it into the game, I should see it in game. It's a bit large, but it's there. And you can change its default orientation and affect its position and angle and so on with actions and events, just like any other kind of object. Now, on top of this being in the engine, there are a number of community members that are making 3D extensions to work with as well. I haven't tried them all personally, but there's of course Pandako's extension, and a few others that I'll link down below in the description that range in usability and complexity and do somewhat different things. And this is just the beginning of 3D with GDevelop. In the future, there's going to be more tools to work with that will allow you to make even better 3D games with GDevelop. But for now, if you want to learn about Pandako's 3D extension, check out this video. So ChatGPT is all the rage. It's been known to give advice, tell funny stories, and even write code. So let's talk about how to use ChatGPT with GDevelop, the open source no-code game engine. So I've been having a conversation with ChatGPT just to see what it would do. And I told it that its name is Helper Bob. because sometimes I need to have fun. And I told it that job was to tell me how to do things in GDevelop. It later said yes, and I thought it would be an easy one by getting it to write JavaScript. To get later jump every 5 seconds using this platform behavior. It again says yes, sure, and then gives you to tell me how to use JavaScript in GDevelop, because you can do that. You can create a JavaScript event block and put in your event just like a regular event, and write JavaScript if you want to. And this all seems very impressive, but the problem is ChatGPT says that sometimes it gets things wrong, and it will very confidently tell you a lie. So if there was something wrong with this JavaScript, I as somebody who doesn't know how to code, wouldn't be able to fix it. Which is kind of a problem. So I moved on to that and asked it to explain to me how to do the same thing, but in a step-by-step way using GDevelop's no-code system with events and actions and conditions. And it started off really well. It told me to set up a game, create a sprite object, and give that platform behavior, and then call it player. Good start. Then we go to the event editor and create a new event. Then, setting up the timer condition, it said, in the timer condition editor, set the following properties, which is a problem because there is no timer condition editor. But I assumed that it meant that the page where you set up the condition properties when you select a scene timer. So I followed the next steps and moved on from there. And I kept following the steps until I got down to the bottom, where it told me to add a repeat event, which GDevelop has. You can right-click on an event and go to add other type and add the repeat type. But ChatGPT thinks that the repeat type repeats over time, whereas the repeat event type repeats multiple times within a single frame of your game, which means the whole thing it was trying to tell me how to do broke down. Especially when it told me to choose forever to repeat the event indefinitely, because if you have an event that tries to repeat indefinitely inside of a single frame, when the game gets to that frame, it's going to freeze. So the next thing I tried to do was get it to try to explain a mechanic just more broadly. So not to get into specifics, because that's where the problem was. ChatGPT doesn't know certain things, and rather than admitting that, it just kind of makes things up. So the next thing I asked it to do was to explain how to break down the steps needed to make enemies spawn on the left side of the screen with a timer without referring to specific actions and conditions in GDevelop. So it'll break down the mechanic into the different parts without getting into specifics and lying to you. And this part worked out pretty well. It starts with setting up the game again, creating an enemy object, then creating a timer that you can use to determine when the enemy is supposed to spawn, then to spawn the enemy. When the timer reaches the desired time interval, trigger an event that spawns a new instance of the enemy at a position off screen on the left. And it even says that this can be done by creating a new enemy object or activating ones that you already have in place. Then setting the enemy movement to make it move to the right side of the screen. Because what I was trying to do was create a game like Last Stand, an old zombie flash game. And it even tried to give some options for that. You could try changing the enemy's position to make them move, or apply a physics force if you gave them the physics behavior. Then reset the timer, because after spawning an enemy and setting its movement, you want to reset the timer so you can do that again. And finally, repeat the process. Again, it thinks that the repeat event is going to work over time, so there are some points with using ChatGPT where you're going to need to use your own judgment to determine what's right and what's wrong. I then asked it to break down how firing a bullet would work. And it does a pretty good job, but unfortunately it doesn't know that extensions exist. So the list it gave me would work, and it's essentially what you need to do when firing a bullet from scratch. But there are faster ways to do it in Engine. So this will get you there, but you should probably also check the extension list to see if someone has created an extension for the mechanic you want to make. So for ChatGPT, because it's not 100% accurate, it's a great tool for helping you break down mechanics and come up with new ideas and ways of doing things, but you'll definitely want to use the search function when adding conditions and actions, because there might be more relevant ones than ChatGPT is willing to show you. And when setting up those actions, try using the expression builder, because it will help you find the expression that you need without having to depend on ChatGPT. So if you want to use ChatGPT with GDevelop to help you build your games, I found this phrase helps to start the conversation. You are Helper Bob. You will help me break down game mechanics into their different components and explain them to me in the simplest way possible, preferably in a step-by-step manner that I can use in GDevelop, the free open source, no code game engine. I'll pin that opening phrase in the comments. But now, if you're curious about how to actually spawn enemies to create a wave defense game like Last Stand, that mechanic gets explained in this video.